2 coppers. That was the price of a half-dead heifer at the Fort Selkirk sale, or a sack of mouldering oats nobody else would take. It was also, Sias would learn that grey morning, the going rate for a woman the camp had decided was finished. She stood on the loading planks behind the trading post with her wrists lashed to the rail, and she did not look up. Snow came down in the lazy, fat way it does just before a hard freeze, settling on her shoulders and not melting, and that told anyone watching how little warmth was left in her. She had stopped shivering an hour ago. That frightened the few decent souls in the crowd more than her bruises did, though none of them stepped forward. A man named only as the quartermaster ran the sale, a soft, sweating fellow in a beaver hat, and he kept knocking the price down because nobody wanted her. She was too thin to work a season, somebody said. Touched in the head, said another, because she hadn't spoken a word in 3 days and wouldn't meet a soul's eye. What none of them understood was that Siza was not broken. She was waiting. She had spent her whole life among men who confused a bowed head for a beaten one, and she had learned that stillness was the only thing they couldn't take off you. So she kept her chin down and her breathing slow, and she counted the way her mother had taught her before the fever took the woman, counted the planks in the boardwalk, crows on the post roof, counted the seconds between the quartermaster's coughs. It gave her mind somewhere to stand while her body endured. The man came down out of the spruce country that same morning, and he had not meant to stop. His name was Tobiah, and he came down to Fort Selkirk twice a winter, no more, because the noise of people sat on him like a wet hide. He was a big man, the kind built thick through the shoulders by 20 years of felling and hauling and breaking ice off a creek with the flat of an axe, and he wore his grey-shot beard, long because shaving was a vanity the mountain had cured him of. He'd come for lamp oil and a coil of snare wire and a sack of flour, and he wanted to be back above the tree line before the light went, because he did not trust the look of that sky. He was tying off his pack mare outside the post when he heard the quartermaster calling the price down to 2 coppers, and something in the flatness of that number stopped him on the step. He did not feel anything heroic. People who knew him would have laughed at the notion. What he felt, looking across the muddy yard at the woman tied to the rail, was a kind of weary disgust that started low in his belly and climbed. He had seen plenty of cruelty in his life, and mostly he'd learned to walk past it, the way you walk past a wolf-killed deer. Nothing to be done, no sense letting it ruin your day. But there was something about how still she held herself. He had pulled links from his traps that thrashed and screamed until the end, and he had pulled others that had simply stopped, gone, quiet and far away inside themselves, waiting for. She had that look. The look of a creature that had decided the trap was the whole world now. 2 coppers, the quartermaster wheezed. Come now. Somebody take her off my hands before she dies on the boards, and I've to dig the hole myself. Tobiah crossed the yard. The crowd parted because men his size made their own road through a gathering. He stopped in front of the planks, and he looked at her, not the way the others had looked, sizing and dismissing, but the way a man looks at weather, trying to read what's coming. I'll give you $1, he said. The quartermaster blinked. $1 was 50 times the asking. He thought he was being mocked. She's not worth $1, Tobiah said again, and he set the coin down on the rail with a sound that ended the conversation. He cut the ropes himself with the skinning knife from his belt, and he was careful about it, working the blade between the hemp and her wrist so as not to nick her, and when the cords fell away, she swayed and he caught her by the elbow. Up close, he could see the bruises had bruises, old yellow ones gone green at the edges, and fresh black ones on top, a record of a long time being struck by hands that knew where it wouldn't show. She still did not look at him. She looked at the snow. Can you walk? He asked. She nodded, which was a lie, and proved it 3 steps later when her knees folded. He didn't make a thing of it. He simply bent and got an arm behind her, and lifted her up onto the mare like she weighed nothing, which by then she nearly didn't, and he wrapped his own coat around her, the heavy wool one waterproofed with rendered fat that stank of wood smoke and bear. She flinched when the weight of it came down on her shoulders, braced for it to be the start of something. It wasn't. He just took up the mare's lead and started walking, on foot, up out of the valley, because he wasn't fool enough to ride double on a tired animal into that sky. They went up through the black spruce in the failing light, and he did not speak to her, and she was grateful for it. Talk, in her experience, was the thing that came before a fist or before a demand, and the silence of this big stranger was the kindest thing anyone had offered her in longer than she could remember. The trail climbed steep, and the snow came harder. And somewhere in the second hour, she stopped being able to feel her feet, and she thought, with the strange flat calm of someone who has stopped fearing death, that she might simply slide off the horse and be done. But every so often, the man reached back without looking and tucked the coat tighter around her boot, or laid his big hand flat against the mare's flank to steady her over the rough ground, and the smallness of those gestures was a thread she found she could not quite let go of. So she held on. His cabin sat in a fold of the mountain where two creeks met, a low building of squared timber, chinked with moss and clay, smoke already gone cold in the chimney because he'd banked the fire that morning and been gone the whole day. He got her down off the mare and through the door, and she stood in the middle of the single room dripping melt onto the packed earth floor, while he built the fire back up with the unhurried economy of a man who had done it 10,000 times. When the flames caught and the light swelled up the walls, she looked at the room properly for the first time. The bunk in the corner, the iron stove, the wall of hanging traps and the bundles of dried sage and the long gun over the door. A man's whole life, lean and ordered and alone. Then she did the thing she believed she was there to do. She set her cold fingers to the laces at the front of her dress and began, with shaking hands, to undo them. Tobiah turned from the fire and saw what she was doing, and something went through his chest like cold water. "Stop that," he said, sharper than he meant to, and she froze, and her face did a terrible thing. It went smooth and blank and ready, bracing for the punishment that came when you did the wrong thing. He saw then what the dollar had bought in her mind. He saw what she'd been told she was. He crossed the room and took an old flannel shirt off the peg by the bunk, big enough to be a tent on her, and he held it out at arm's length, not stepping any closer than he had to. "Put this on," he said, quieter now. "You'll catch your death in those wet things. There's nothing owed here. You understand me? Nothing's owed." She did not understand him. Not really. Not for a long time. But she took the shirt, and she turned her back to dress, and the flannel swallowed her down to the knees, and smelled of cedar and smoke, and when she turned around again he had already looked away, busying himself with a pot of beans on the stove top, giving her the privacy of his turned back. It was such a small thing. She stood there in his shirt, with her arms wrapped around herself, and felt something crack very quietly behind her ribs, some long frozen thing beginning, dangerously, to thaw. He fed her. He scraped the whole pot onto a tin plate and handed it down to where she'd folded herself onto the floor by the stove, refusing the chair, and she looked at the mountain of food and then up at him with a question in her eyes. "I haven't done any work," she said. They were the first words she'd spoken in days, and her voice came out rusty as an old hinge. "Eat the beans," he said, and turned away so she wouldn't feel watched. She didn't eat like a starved thing, which he noticed, and which troubled him more than if she had. She ate slowly, carefully, chewing each bite to nothing, making it last, the discipline of a person who had learned never to trust that there would be more. He sat across the room with his back against the logs and packed his pipe, and let her be, and he thought about the men down in Fort Selkirk, and he was glad the snow had come, because it meant he wouldn't be tempted to ride back down and do something that would get him hanged. That was the first night. He told her her name was hers to keep. Sa, she said, when he asked, the way her mother had said it, soft, the ah swallowed. And he told her his, and then he laid out a bedroll on the floor by the stove and gave her the bunk, and when she protested he lied and said his back preferred the hard ground, which she did not believe but was too tired to argue. She lay in the warm and listened to his breathing across the room, even and slow, and she waited a long time for him to come to her, because in her experience that was what the night was for. He never did. Some time before dawn she finally slept, and it was the first sleep in years that she did not have to keep one eye open through. The winter closed its fist around the mountain. In the third week, the cold came down so hard, the sap froze in the standing trees. And they cracked open in the night with the sound of gunshots, and Saya would jolt awake each time certain that men had come. She made herself useful, because usefulness was the only armor she'd ever owned. She scrubbed the dirt floor until her knuckles split and wept, trying to clean a thing that could not be cleaned, and Tobiah found her at it one morning, bent over the ground with her raw hands in the freezing washwater, and he did a thing that startled them both. He knelt down and took her wrists, gently, in his two big hands, and turned them over so she had to look at the torn skin. "You can't scrub dirt," he said. "It's a dirt floor. You're only making mud. I have to earn my keep," she said, and there was a thin edge of panic in it, because if she wasn't earning, then what was she, and what would stop him from deciding she wasn't worth the food? "You don't owe me a floor," he said. He let go of her hands and went to the shelf, and came back with a little tin of pine pitch salve, and he set it in her lap. "Put that on, and stop trying to pay off a thing that was never a debt." She stared at the tin a long while, after he'd gone back out to his trapline. She did not have the language yet for what was wrong with her, which was that she had been a debt her entire life, owed to her father, then sold to settle his, passed from hand to hand as a thing with a price, and that a man telling her she owed nothing was the most disorienting cruelty of all, because it took away the only ground she knew how to stand on. She rubbed the salve into her cracked knuckles and she wept, and she did not fully know why. It was the fever that finally broke the silence between them. The years of being half-starved had hollowed her out, and the brutal climb up the mountain had taken the last of her, and one evening she simply could not rise from the bunk. The cough came first, dry and rattling, and then the heat, a fever that turned her skin to paper and lit her cheeks an unnatural red. Tobiah came in from the cold and found her shaking so hard the bunk frame knocked against the wall, and when he laid the back of his hand to her brow he swore, long and low, a streak of profanity aimed at the mountain and the men in the valley, and at his own helplessness. He did not sleep for 4 days. He kept the fire roaring until the cabin baked. He melted snow and trickled water between her cracked lips, a spoonful at a time. He stripped the wet shirts off her when the fever broke into sweats and dressed her in dry ones and looked the whole while at the ceiling, granting her a dignity she had not known a man could grant. And in the deep of the fever she talked, the way she always had as a child, the babbling river of it. She begged a man called Only Pike not to lock her in the shed. She pleaded with somebody to leave her sister be. She said, "I'll be good, I'll be good, I'll be good," in a voice gone small and young, and Tobiah sat by the bunk in the dark with his jaw set like granite, and listened to the whole map of her ruin spill out of her, and he understood then exactly what he had pulled off the loading planks at Fort Selkirk. On the 4th day the fever broke for good, and she woke clear-eyed and weak as a kitten, and the first thing she did was look at her hands, ashamed, because she knew she talked in the fever. "Did I say things?" she asked. He was at the stove with his back to her. He thought about Pike. He thought about the shed, and the sister, and the "I'll be good." "You mumbled about flour sacks," he said. Nothing that made sense. It was a lie, and she half knew it was a lie, and the kindness of the lie undid something in her that the truth never could have. "How long was I down?" she asked. 4 days. Her eyes went wide. Who ran your line? Who cut the wood?" "I managed," he said. She tried to argue, and he set a bowl of cornmeal mush in front of her, and told her stomach couldn't take pork yet, and that was the end of the argument. For a week she mended slowly, and fought him the entire way, hating the bunk, hating idleness, feeling exposed the moment her hands were empty, and he let her come back to herself by inches. She darned his wool socks with a bone needle. She sorted his box of percussion caps by size. She peeled the frost-bitten potatoes thin. He watched her do it, and understood at last that the work was not about the debt at all. The work was the rope she'd thrown across the chasm to keep from falling in. It was how she proved, hour by hour, that she was still alive and still herself. So he found her things to mend, not because he needed them mended, but because he had begun, without quite admitting it, to want her to stay. The thaw was a long way off, but the worst of the cold broke, and there came an afternoon when the wind died, and the sun came hammering off the snow so bright it hurt, and the world dripped and glittered and felt, for an hour, survivable. They sat on the step with the door open, and the warmth pouring in, and she told him, in her own time and her own words, about the sister sold south, about the father who'd gambled them both, about Pike who'd bought her last and used her worst, and Tobiah listened without once telling her it would be all right, because he was not a man who lied about the future, and somehow that made the listening worth more. Then the mountain reminded them both that it did not care. He'd gone up the high line alone in the last hard week of winter to pull the traps before the melt rotted the sets, and he was crossing a snow-bridged talus slope he'd crossed 100 times, when the rotten ice gave under him and dropped his right leg into a fissure between two slabs of granite to the thigh. He heard the bone go before he felt it. The pain came a half-second behind the sound and whited out the world. When he could see again, the snow around his leg was already going red, and the cold had a hold of his chest, and he did the arithmetic the way he'd done it his whole life. 1.5 miles from the cabin, the light failing, the temperature falling with it, and his foot locked in the stone jaw of the mountain, he cut his suspender free with the antler knife and wrapped it twice round his thigh above the break, and pulled it tight enough to scream through his clenched teeth. And then he set to the boot. It took 20 minutes of butchery, slicing the laces and peeling the stiff leather back and dragging the ruined leg up out of the rock, and twice the pain sent him spinning down into the grey, and twice he came back up, because the alternative was to stay down there and freeze. He left the boot in the fissure. Then he began to crawl, elbows and one good knee, the wrecked leg dragging a red furrow behind him through the snow. He made perhaps 300 yards before his body simply quit. The cold had got into the core of him, and his thoughts had gone thick and slow and far away, and he laid his head against the base of a great spruce and looked up through the black branches at the hard, indifferent stars, and what he felt was not fear. It was disappointment, bitter and complete. He had spent his whole life perfecting the art of needing no one, of being a man so self-sufficient the world could not touch him, and now, at the very end of it, the one thought that came clear through the closing dark was that he did not want her to be alone again, that she would wait in the cabin, and he would not come, and she would learn, one more time, that everything gets taken. That was the thing he could not bear. Not the dying, the leaving her. It was Sisa who came. She had felt the wrongness of it when the light failed. And he hadn't returned, and she had not waited and wrung her hands like the frightened girl she'd been a season ago. She'd lit the lantern and taken the long gun and the wool blankets and followed the trapline out into the dark on foot, calling his name into the wind, and she had nearly walked past him in the blackness but for the dark shape of him against the pale snow. She got the blankets around him, and she got him onto a travois she lashed together from 2 saplings, and his own coat with hands that did not shake. Because somewhere in the long apprenticeship of her suffering, she had learned exactly how to do hard things while terrified. She dragged a man twice her weight, a mile and a half hemwike, a mile and a half through the snow in the dark. Not once, because there are debts that have nothing to do with money, and this was the only one she had ever wanted to pay. She set the leg as best she knew, with splints of split cedar and strips torn from her own shift, and she packed the wound with the pine pitch salve, and she sat up with him through the fever that followed, the way he had sat up with her, melting snow and spooning broth, and lying to him gently in the dark, when he raved that it would all be fine. The mountain had turned the whole thing around. The one who had been bought was now the one keeping the other alive, and somewhere in those long nights the last of the ledger between them quietly burned to ash. The leg healed crooked. There was no helping it. She'd done what she could, and the bone had knit the way it wanted. By the time the ground stabilized and the smell of wet pine and the first bare grass came up through the rotten snow, he could stand and he could walk. But he walked with a heavy lean on a cedar cane he'd carved by the stove, and he would never again run, never again haul an elk out alone, never again be the self-sufficient creature he'd built his whole identity around. He stood on the step one violet evening, looking out over the green valley filling in below, and he turned the new shape of his life over in his hands, and he was surprised to find he did not grieve it as he'd thought he would. She came out and stood beside him at the rail. She wasn't wearing flour sacks anymore. She'd cut down one of his old blankets over the winter and stitched it into a proper skirt, and she wore it with a flannel shirt gone soft from washing, and her hair was clean and pulled back, and the dead far-off look was gone out of her eyes entirely. She looked older than the woman on the loading planks. She looked like she belonged to herself. "Trail's dry," she said, watching the horizon. "It is," he said. "Stage runs out of Fort Selkirk on Thursdays." He kept his eyes on the far ridge. "You could be on it by Friday if you went down tomorrow and rode hard. Take the mare. She's yours. You earned her 10 times over." Sawise didn't answer right away. She reached into the deep pocket of the wool skirt and took something out and set it down on the porch rail between them, and when he looked at it his brow folded in confusion, because it was $1, a whole silver dollar, the very one he'd laid on the rail at Fort Selkirk to buy her. "Where'd you get that?" he said. "I've had it since that morning," she said, her voice steady. "It fell in the mud when you set it down. The quartermaster never picked it up. He was too busy staring at your knife. I stepped on it, pushed it down into the muck with my heel while everyone was looking at you. When you lifted me onto the horse, I dug it out, and I've kept it ever since." He stared at the coin. He understood what it meant, the way you understand a thing all at once, completely, in your whole body. She had had the means to run from the first night. $1 would have bought her a stage ticket clear out of the territory, would have bribed a driver, would have got her free of him and the mountain and the whole frozen world before the first hard snow ever fell. She had had her freedom in her pocket the entire time. "Why didn't you go?" he said, and it came out as barely a sound. She turned to face him. She looked at his grey beard and the scar on his cheek, and the cane leaning against his crooked leg, and she slid the coin across the rough wood with one finger until it touched the back of his hand. "Because I didn't want to be bought," she said, "and I didn't want to run. Both of those are things that happen to you. I wanted to choose. I've never once in my life chosen a single thing, and I wasn't going to let the first thing I ever chose be running away in the dark." Her finger stayed on the coin against his knuckles. "I'm paying it back, the whole of it. There's no debt now, Tobiah. I don't owe you and you don't owe me. The ledger's closed. You're free," he said, and his voice broke on it. "You always were. You can take the mare tomorrow." She didn't move her hand off his. Her fingers slid from the cold coin to his warm, calloused knuckles and wrapped around them. "I don't want the mare," she said. He looked up. Whatever it was he'd spent 30 years building behind his eyes. The wall, the distance, the careful nothing. It was simply gone, and he stood there in front of her with nothing left to hide behind. which terrified him more than the fisher had. She took a breath, and he could see what it cost her, could see the courage it took to ask for something out loud, when every time before, in her life, asking had earned her a closed fist. "I've paid my debt," she said, and her voice trembled, and she let it. "So I'm asking you as a free woman now, with nothing owed in either direction. When the winter comes back round, and it will, do you want me here?" And the question hung there in the cool blue mountain dusk and went through the last unbroken place in him, like light through ice. It didn't break him with cruelty. It broke him with grace, with the unbearable arrival of a kindness he was dead, certain he had never earned. He let the cane fall. It clattered on the porch boards, and he didn't reach for it. He reached for her instead, both hands, and pulled her into his chest and put his face down in her clean hair, and he held her against the ruined body she had dragged back from the dark. And he could feel her heart going strong and steady against his own. "I," he got out, the word muffled in her hair, his whole frame shaking. "God help me. Yes, I want you here." And she wrapped her arms around his waist and held on just as hard, her face pressed into the wool coat that smelled of smoke and cedar, the coat that had been the first warm thing the world had given her without a price. The wind came down off the granite peaks the way it always had, cold and uncaring and old as the rock, but on the step of the small timber cabin, where the two creeks met, with the dark coming gentle over the valley. And the dollar lying forgotten and meaningless on the rail, the long winter was finally over.